Today we're going to talk about James Madison, who was the fourth president of the United States and the first president that took the United States to war. So England and France were still at war and had been since George Washington was in office. And the entire time, all three presidents, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, had all tried different ways of staying neutral and not getting involved in the war between England and France. So remember, like John Adams tried to work with France to stop attacking the ships, and France wanted a bribe. That was the XYZ affair. Thomas Jefferson, he went about it by passing the Embargo Act that said that we weren't going to trade with anybody, both of which were not probably the best plans. So when James Madison became the president, he had the same task of trying to remain neutral, even though France and England were at war, and we were trying to trade with both countries, and both countries were attacking our ships so that we would not give those supplies to the other country. So that being said, James Madison felt that England was the bigger threat than France, and so a lot of our dealings with England were very kind of fragile. So one of the big problems of this England and France being at war was that the British had a really strong navy, and it was not a great place to work. It was really hard to be a sailor in the British Navy, and the sailors would desert all the time. They would leave. And so the British were always looking for sailors. So one of the first causes of the War of 1812, which is going to be where the United States and England are going to go to war, is going to be the impressment of sailors. So what happens is that because the British needed sailors to work on their ships in the Navy to fight the French, they would travel, they would sail through the Atlantic Ocean, and when they would come across a ship, they would kidnap the sailors that were on the ship and force them to be sailors in the British Navy, even if you didn't want to be. So think about in today, if all of a sudden a foreign country started coming over and kidnapping our people and forcing them to work in a foreign military, that would be ridiculous. But that's what was happening. And so a lot of people were really upset that England was doing this to American citizens. So that was one of the major causes of the War of 1812, because there's three. This is the first one. So the British are impressing American sailors. They're forcing them to work on British ships and fighting this war against France. So that was a problem. The second cause of the War of 1812 is going to be that the British are going to be helping the Native Americans. So if you think about when we talked about Thomas Jefferson purchased a large tract of land, which was the Louisiana Territory, and it doubled the size of the United States. But think about who was already living in that territory before the United States technically bought it, right? The Native Americans. And after Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory, people started to spread and travel and settle in the West. And the Native Americans had already given up thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land and were being pushed off their land and needed a way to try and keep their territory. And so they looked to the British, who controlled Canada, which is right above the United States, for help. And the British started to supply the Native Americans with weapons that they could use to fight the American settlers who were moving west. Well, this made the American people upset, because here we were trying to expand and gain more land and power and grow our country, and the British are helping the Native Americans try and keep us from doing that. So this was another reason why we weren't very happy with the British. So cause one, the British were kidnapping or impressing our sailors and forcing them to work on British ships. And now cause number two, the British were giving Native Americans weapons that the Native Americans were using to keep us from expanding west and settling in that Louisiana Territory that we had purchased from France. The third cause of the War of 1812 was that there were war hawks, which were men in Congress who were very much for a war. And war hawks wanted a very aggressive response to the British for what the British were doing with the impressment and the giving the Native Americans weapons. They wanted to increase military spending. They wanted to have more land. And they thought that the only way that we could do that was to go to war. So they pressured James Madison. There was a lot of war hawks in Congress, and they really pressured James Madison to get us ready to go to war. So it's super, super important that you know those three causes of the War of 1812. So the British were impressing or kidnapping American sailors. They were giving weapons to Native Americans, and then the war hawks were demanding an aggressive approach to the British by going to war. Okay, so because of all three of these causes, war is going to be inevitable. And so war is going to break out, and we're gonna declare war on England in 1812. That's why it's called the War of 1812. And one of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to try and take over Canada. We had a brilliant idea that we needed not just this Louisiana Purchase land that we had just bought, but that we needed Canada as well. So we marched our troops into Canada thinking that we are going to take over this giant chunk of land, and we were wrong. So what happened was that we declared war in 1812, and we march our troops to Canada, and one of the first things that we do is we go to Canada's capital, which was it was British territory. It was claimed by England in their capital, York, and we tried to take over the capital and other cities by setting fire to them to try and weaken the British. But we realized very quickly that having that much land to try and control was ridiculous, and we retreated back to the United States. So going to Canada was pretty much a ridiculous idea. Then, in 1814, so 2 years after we declared war on England, England had been fighting two wars. They'd been fighting a war with England and France, and they'd been fighting a war between England and us, right? So they were fighting a war on both sides. Well, in 1814, they defeated France, and they turned their full might on the United States. Because before, they could just kind of left us alone. They're like, oh, well, you know, whatever, we'll send some troops, but our main goal is going to be defeating France. But once they defeated France, they're going to send all of their troops and supplies and manpower into conquering us, right? So that was a problem. So the first thing that the British are going to do is they're going to set up a blockade. And this picture is just really a good example to show you what a blockade is. And all it really is that the British, they don't line up in rows like this in the middle of the ocean. What they do is they have a bunch of ships out here in the water, and then as American ships are trying to leave to go and trade with their lands, they would attack the ships and either impress the sailors or kill the sailors or whatever and keep them from trading with other countries. So that's what a blockade was. So that's the first thing that England did, was they set up this blockade to try and hurt our shipping. And they really made it hard for us to try and do any kind of trade with other countries. And that's going to make us really reliant on making goods in our own country. And it kind of ends up being a good thing for us, but that's going to come later. So after England set up this blockade, the second thing that they're going to do is kind of seek revenge on us for burning their capital in Canada, in York. So they're going to turn their attention to our capital, which is Washington, D.C. So the British marched to Washington, D.C. There's a couple of militia. We do not have a strong army whatsoever. So they are quickly taken care of, and the British march into Washington and promptly began to set fire to all of the government buildings, including the library, Congress, the White House, and the Capitol was pretty much destroyed. All that was left of the White House, it burned down completely, was the outer wall, like a shell. It had to be rebuilt completely from the ground up. On top of that, not only did the British burn the Capitol and their fires were raging for days, then there was a hurricane, and so there was strong gale force winds, water everywhere. It was crazy. And then there was a tornado. So it was like all of these things, one after the other, that just caused just tremendous damage in Washington, D.C. One of the things that happened while this was going on was that everybody was getting evacuated out of Washington, D.C. as the British were approaching, because we knew that we weren't going to be able to hold the city. James Madison himself had already left to go and try and rally troops to try and get the British to go somewhere else. And his wife stayed in the White House because she refused to leave all of the important things, all of the paintings, all of the artifacts, all of the things that had been in the White House, you know, from the American Revolution, from, you know, the beginning of our government, those kinds of things. So she refused to leave. I mean, she had servants take as much as they could possibly put into wagons. And one of the things that she saved was this giant picture of George Washington that she cracked out of the frame and rolled up. and snuck out of the White House. And as she's leaving, the British are, you know, marching into the White House to set it on fire. So she was very brave. And because of her doing that, we have lots of artifacts and documents and things that we would not have had if she hadn't have done that. So the British burn Washington, D.C., but they don't stay. They set their sights for Baltimore. There's a picture of the White House burning. They set their sights for Baltimore, and Baltimore is just a little south of Washington, D.C. And Baltimore is a very, very important port city, and it would have been really beneficial for the British to take over as they were having a war, because they would be able to take soldiers and things in and out, you know, and it was very protected. So this Baltimore port city was a very important port that the British wanted to attack. Ports are always things that when you have a war, you want to try and take over, because it's going to help your trade, and it's going to help your supplies, and it's going to hurt your enemies. So the British wanted to take over Baltimore. Now, standing in their way was Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry was out in the water. It was kind of like an island, and the British surrounded the fort, and the men inside had to defend it. And the British bombarded the fort for 25 hours. There's just a cool little story. The captain of the fort had ordered a giant flag long before the British arrived in Baltimore to be made. And it ended up being, if you were to take my room, Mr. Leatherwood's room, and Miss Bacon's room, that's how big the flag was. It was humongous. And he had it made and put it in the fort. And when the British arrived and started sailing towards Fort McHenry, he had it raised. So that way the British could see, like, we were proud Americans, we're not going to give up the fort, and those kinds of, that was happening. And so when the battle started, when the British started bombarding the fort and firing on the fort, the flag was lowered, but it was, you know, it was still there. So the battle went on for 25 hours. So for 25 hours nonstop, there was bombs, there was rockets, there was all of these things happening all through the night, right? But the next morning, the fort still stood. The men refused to surrender. There was actually no casualties whatsoever. And the Americans didn't give up the fort. Now, while all this was going on, there was a man by the name of Francis Scott Key who was on a British ship because he was a lawyer, and one of his friends had been captured and was a prisoner on one of the boats. And so he was there trying to get his friend off the boat. And so he actually saw the battle take place as it was going on. And so he was really nervous because he didn't think that the Americans could hold the fort. And it wasn't until the next morning when the flag, this giant American flag, was raised above the fort that he was so inspired, and he knew that we had kept the fort and we weren't going to give up the city, that he decided to write a poem called The Defense at Fort McHenry. Later, that poem ended up being known as the Star-Spangled Banner. So if you ever wondered what our national anthem was about, it was about the Battle of Fort McHenry. He was talking about the flag. And there's a picture of the fort just to show you kind of what it looked like. So the bombs were bursting in air all night. That's just a picture of the scale of what the flag looked like. And this is what the flag looks like today. It's in a museum in Washington, D.C. A lot of pieces are missing because it's old. And finally, the war is going to end, and we're going to have one last battle, which is going to be the Battle of New Orleans. And it actually takes place 2 weeks after the War of 1812 ends. And just because mail was slow, we didn't find out about the war being over until after this battle took place. So the British wanted to take over the port of New Orleans, again, because ports are really important. And Andrew Jackson and his men were sent down to New Orleans to stop the British. The British were not used to the swampy terrain, and Jackson was able to quickly stop the fighting to stop the British from attacking. I think the battle only lasted like 30 minutes. The British were slaughtered. They were just out in the open. Jackson's men hid behind cotton bales, and the cotton absorbed the bullets from the British, so it's like battle armor almost, and the British just got destroyed. So they retreated, and Jackson becomes this national war hero because of this battle. So the effects of this war are super important because just like the causes, the effects are just the same. So 2 big things happen. Number one, Native American strength is weakened, and that's going to be beneficial because it's going to help Americans be able to settle out west and push Native Americans off their land because the British lost, the Native Americans lost their ally. And then also, United States manufacturing increased because we couldn't trade with other countries due to that British blockade. We were forced to make our own goods. This is going to make our industry and manufacturing increase and is going to make us a much more powerful superpower of a country. So even though the War of 1812 wasn't as popular with a lot of people, it did do a lot of good things for the United States and help pave our way for growth in the future.